In the white marble main hall of Grant and Rowe Bank, Amelia Grant, in a simple wool coat and faded jeans, walked in with no one realizing this was the bank her family owned. She smiled as she requested to withdraw $10,000, but the teller barely glanced before saying coldly, "For that amount, you need an appointment with the manager." A customer behind her snickered, probably a waitress cashing out months of tips. The nearby security guard folded his arms, eyeing her as if she were about to cause trouble. Amelia didn't argue, just handed over her ID, and minutes later a short text from her phone set the entire upstairs in motion, signaling she was no ordinary customer. Amelia stood there, her hands steady on the counter, her face calm despite the whispers rippling through the line behind her. The teller, a young woman with sharp red nails and a name tag that read, Brittany, flicked her eyes over Amelia's plain coat and scuffed sneakers. She tapped her keyboard with a little more force than needed, like she was already annoyed. The air in the lobby felt heavy, the kind of heavy that comes when people are watching, judging, waiting for something to go wrong. Amelia's ID sat on the counter, untouched for a moment, until Brittany finally picked it up with a sigh. She scanned it, and her eyebrows twitched just for a second, when the screen flashed something she didn't expect. "System's down right now," Brittany said, her voice flat, shoving the ID back toward Amelia. The woman behind Amelia, dressed in a tailored blazer and dripping with gold jewelry, leaned forward and muttered to her friend, "Can you believe this?" holding up the line for no reason. Amelia's fingers paused on her ID, but her eyes didn't waver. She slid it back into her wallet, slow and deliberate, and sent a 5-word text. "I'm at branch number 5. A man in a pinstripe suit standing third in line decided to join in. His cufflinks gleamed as he adjusted his glasses, his voice loud enough to carry across the lobby. Some people think they can just walk in and demand whatever they want," he said, smirking at the woman in the blazer. "No manners, no class." The crowd murmured a few, nodding in agreement. Amelia's hand froze on her wallet just for a moment before she tucked it into her bag. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his, and said, "Manners don't need cufflinks." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they cut through the noise like a blade. The man's smirk faltered, his glasses slipping down his nose as he fumbled for a response. The lobby hushed, eyes darting between them, but Amelia was already turning back to the counter, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag as if nothing had happened. "Hey, if you're feeling this story, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and maybe subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to share these moments with you, to walk through these stories together." All right, let's keep going. The lobby was buzzing now, a low hum of impatience and curiosity. Brittany called over the branch manager, a man named Greg, who strode out with a tight smile and a suit that looked one size too small. Greg was the kind of guy who loved the sound of his own voice, always quick to remind everyone he'd been with the bank for 15 years. He glanced at Amelia, his eyes lingering on her faded jeans, and his smile tightened even more. "What do you need this money for?" he asked, loud enough for the whole line to hear. A few customers smirked, one guy in a flashy watch, openly recording the exchange on his phone. "I mean, 10 grand in cash. That's not exactly pocket change," Greg added, folding his arms like he'd caught her in something. Amelia tilted her head slightly, her expression still calm, and said, "It's for a purchase." Her voice was soft but clear, like she was stating a fact no one could argue with. Greg blinked, thrown off for a second, but recovered fast. "We'll need to verify a few things," he said, motioning to the security guard, a burly guy named Tony, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Tony stepped closer, his boots heavy on the marble floor, and asked for 2 more forms of ID. Amelia handed over a passport and a credit card, her movements precise, like she'd done this 100 times before. As Tony flipped through her passport, a woman in a sleek pencil skirt and high heels clicked her way to the front of the line, cutting past 2 others. She was the kind of person who carried herself, like she owned the room, her designer handbag swinging with every step. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with impatience, "but can we hurry this up? Some of us have actual business to handle." She shot a glance at Amelia, her lips curling into a sneer. Not everyone's here to play pretend with their little withdrawal. The crowd tittered, a few stifled laughs, breaking the tension. Amelia didn't look at her. She just adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers slow and steady, and said, "Business doesn't need a handbag." The woman's sneer froze, her hand tightening on her purse. The laughter stopped, replaced by a ripple of unease. Tony handed back Amelia's passport, his eyes flicking to the woman like he was sizing up the situation. The woman huffed, stepping back, but her cheeks were flushed, her confidence rattled. The line behind her was getting restless now, people shifting their weight, checking their watches. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat, her perfume sharp enough to cut through the air, leaned toward the guy next to her and said, "She doesn't even look like she belongs here." Her friend, a skinny guy with gelled hair and a silk tie, chuckled. "What you think she's gonna rob the place with that coat?" The laughter spread low and mean like a wave rolling through the crowd. Brittany, still at the counter, smirked and whispered something to another teller, who glanced at Amelia and shook her head. Amelia didn't react, didn't even turn to look at them. She just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture straight but not stiff. Tony the guard flipped through her passport like he was searching for a hidden code, then handed it back with a grunt. "This is taking too long," the woman in the fur coat snapped loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can you move her to the side or something?" Amelia's eyes flicked toward her just for a moment and she said, "I'm not in your way." The woman froze her mouth half open like she hadn't expected a response. The lobby went quiet for a beat, the kind of quiet that feels like the air's holding its breath. Upstairs, something was happening. The head of security, a guy named Victor with a buzz cut and a permanent frown, got a ping on his phone. It was an internal note, short and sharp. "Assist this person immediately." Victor's jaw tightened as he read it, his eyes narrowing like he recognized the name but couldn't quite place it. He grabbed his radio and headed for the stairs, his steps quick and heavy. Down in the lobby, Greg was still playing his part, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "We just need to be thorough. You understand?" he said to Amelia, like he was explaining something to a child. "Big withdrawals like this, we have to make sure everything's legit." He leaned in a little, lowering his voice. "You sure you don't want to come back another day?" Amelia looked at him, her gaze steady, and said, "I'm sure." 2 words, but they landed like a brick. Greg's smile faltered and he straightened up, glancing at Brittany like she'd back him up. She didn't. She was staring at her screen, her fingers frozen on the keyboard, like she'd just seen something she wasn't supposed to. A janitor pushing a cart of cleaning supplies paused near the counter, his eyes lingering on Amelia. He was older, his uniform faded, his hands rough from years of work. He'd seen a lot in this bank. People coming and going, some treated like royalty, others like they didn't exist. He leaned on his mop, watching the scene unfold, and muttered to himself, "They don't even know who she is." His voice was low, barely audible, but Amelia's head turned slightly, catching his eye. She gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible, and he nodded back, his lips pressing into a thin line. The exchange went unnoticed by the crowd, but it carried a weight like a secret shared between 2 people who'd seen the world's unfairness up close. The janitor pushed his cart away, his steps slow, like he was carrying more than just cleaning supplies. Amelia's fingers brushed the edge of her bag, her face unchanged, but her shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction, like she'd found an ally in the chaos. Victor hit the lobby floor, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Amelia. He paused just for a second, like something clicked in his head. He walked over, his voice low but firm. "Everything okay here?" he asked, looking at Greg, not Amelia. Greg nodded, but his hands were fidgeting with a pen, clicking it over and over. "Just doing our due diligence," he said, but his voice wasn't as steady now. Victor glanced at Amelia, and she met his eyes, her expression still calm, like she was waiting for something inevitable. "Let's move this to the VIP room," Victor said, motioning toward a hallway. Amelia nodded, picking up her bag, a simple canvas thing, frayed at the strap, and followed him. The crowd parted as she walked, some still whispering, some still recording. The woman in the fur coat muttered, "VIP. Her must be a mistake." Amelia didn't turn, didn't flinch. She just kept walking her steps, even her bag swinging lightly at her side. In the hallway, a young intern barely 20 was carrying a stack of files so high she could hardly see over them. She bumped into Amelia, nearly dropping the papers, and gasped, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Her face was red, her eyes wide with panic, expecting a scolding. Amelia steadied her with a gentle hand, picking up a file that had slipped to the floor. "No harm done," she said, her voice warm, like she was talking to a friend. The intern blinked, her shoulders relaxing, and mumbled a thank you before scurrying off. But she glanced back, her eyes lingering on Amelia like she'd just met someone who didn't fit the bank's usual mold. Amelia handed the file to Victor, who took it without a word, his expression unreadable. The hallway was quiet now, the lobby's noise fading behind them, but the weight of those eyes, those whispers still hung in the air. Amelia's steps didn't falter, her hand steady on her bag like she was carrying something heavier than canvas. The VIP room was all dark wood and leather chairs, the kind of place that screamed money. Greg led the way, his smile back, but shakier now. He motioned for Amelia to sit, then started shuffling papers on the desk, pretending to be busy. "Just need to pull up a few things," he said, his voice too loud for the small room. Victor stood by the door, arms crossed, watching. The vault was right there. A massive steel door in the corner left wide open like it was no big deal. Stacks of cash and rows of safety deposit boxes gleamed inside, catching the light. Greg glanced at it, then at Amelia, like he was waiting for her to make a move. She didn't. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes scanning the room, not the vault, but the details. The scuff on the table, the crooked picture frame, the way Greg's tie was slightly off-center. Then without a word, she walked to the vault and pulled the door shut. The clang echoed in the room. She drew the curtain closed, turned back to the table, and started straightening the chairs like she was tidying up her own house. Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't expected that. A faint sound came from the hallway, a car horn, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet. Amelia's hand paused on a chair, her eyes flicking to the window. Outside, a beat-up sedan idled at the curb, its driver leaning out to yell at a delivery truck. The sound was gone as quick as it came, but Amelia's fingers tightened on the chair just for a moment before she let go. It was the kind of car her brother used to drive back when they were kids, before the family's wealth became a weight they all carried. She didn't linger on it, didn't let her face show anything, but her hand brushed the edge of her bag, where a small keychain dangled, a faded metal star, scratched and worn. She sat back down, her movement smooth like the moment hadn't happened. Greg didn't notice, too busy fumbling with his papers, but Victor's eyes narrowed like he'd caught something no one else had. Victor raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching like he was fighting a smile. "We'll get this sorted," he said, his voice softer now, like he was starting to see something Greg didn't. Amelia nodded, her hands brushing the edge of the table as she sat back down. Greg cleared his throat, his face flushed. "Right. Well, I'll need to step out for a minute," he said, and slipped through the door, leaving it cracked just enough to watch her. He stood there, peering through the gap, his fingers tight on the handle. Amelia didn't move. She just sat there, her bag on the floor, her hands still. The camera in the corner was off. Greg had made sure of that, but he didn't know Victor had already clocked it. Victor's radio crackled and he stepped into the hall, his voice low as he spoke into it. Amelia's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, answered, and said, "I'm at branch number 5. Her voice was steady, like she was giving directions to a friend. On the other end, the bank's CEO, a man named Richard, paused, then said something short. Amelia hung up her face unchanged and slipped the phone back into her bag. Downstairs, the lobby was still humming with gossip. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt, his face red from too much sun, was at the counter, now complaining loudly about the wait. "This is why I don't come to this branch," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the line. "They let anybody walk in and waste everyone's time." He shot a glance at Amelia's empty spot at the counter, like she was still there dragging things out. Brittany nodded, her lips tight, like she agreed but didn't want to say it out loud. The man kept going, his voice rising. "You'd think they'd screen people better, keep the riffraff out." A few customers chuckled, but others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away. Brittany's fingers hesitated on her keyboard, her eyes flicking to the hallway where Amelia had gone. She leaned toward the other teller, her voice low. "You think she's really trouble?" The other teller shrugged, but her eyes stayed on the hallway like she wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, the vault was empty. Not a single bill, not a single gold bar left. Greg was in a panic, his tie askew, his voice sharp as he barked orders at the staff. "It was her," he said to Tony, the security guard, who was pacing the lobby. "She was in there alone. Had to be her." Brittany nodded, her red nails tapping nervously on the counter. She didn't look right from the start. She said, her voice low, but eager, like she was finally part of something big. The police showed up, their radios crackling as they took statements. Amelia was there, sitting in a small office off the lobby, her hands folded, her coat draped over the chair. The officer, a tired-looking guy named Daniels, asked her what she'd been doing in the VIP room. She answered calmly, her voice, even laying out exactly what happened when she arrived, what Greg said, how she closed the vault. Daniels scribbled notes, his pen scratching loud in the quiet room. "Anything else?" he asked. Amelia leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Check the vault logs and hand over signatures," she said. Daniels paused, then nodded like he'd heard something in her voice he couldn't ignore. Back at the bank, A delivery guy in a faded cap was unloading boxes near the entrance, his cart rattling on the marble floor. He'd been there the day before, seen the whole thing go down. As he stacked the boxes, he overheard Brittany whispering to Tony about the thief in the VIP room. He snorted, shaking his head and muttered, "Y'all are barking up the wrong tree." Tony turned his eyes narrowing, but the delivery guy just kept working his hands moving fast, like he had said his piece and was done. Amelia, stepping out of the office, caught the tail end of it. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him, but her fingers brushed that star keychain again, her steps slowing just enough to notice the box's supplies for the small business fund, the same one she'd later donate to. The delivery guy tipped his cap barely noticeable and pushed his cart out the door. The lobby didn't see it, but something passed between them, a quiet understanding like two people who knew what it meant to be underestimated. The staff was buzzing now, customers from the day before, back some whispering, some just watching. The woman in the fur coat was there again, her phone out, filming the chaos. "Told you she was trouble," she said to the guy with the gelled hair, who nodded like he'd predicted it all. Greg was in his office typing up a report, his fingers shaking as he described Amelia's suspicious behavior. He sent it to the higher-ups, seeing half the executive board, hinting she was the only one who'd been in the room. Tony the guard was outside muttering to another staff member. "Doesn't add up," he said, scratching his head. She didn't even touch the vault. But Greg wasn't listening. He was too busy building his case, his voice loud as he called headquarters, demanding an emergency meeting. Amelia, meanwhile, was on her way to the police station, her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps steady as ever. She didn't look back, didn't rush. She just kept walking like she knew exactly where this was going. At the station, a clerk behind the desk handed Amelia a form to sign, her eyes flicking up with a mix of curiosity and pity. The form was standard just procedure, but the clerk's hands lingered on it like she wanted to say something. "Rough day, huh?" she finally said, her voice soft, almost kind. Amelia looked at her, her eyes steady but not cold, and signed the form with a smooth practice motion. "Just another day," she said, sliding the paper back. The clerk's smile faltered like she'd expected more, but Amelia was already turning to leave her bag swinging lightly at her side. Outside, a kid on a skateboard zipped by his music blaring from a speaker, the same song her brother used to play on repeat. Amelia's hand brushed her keychain again, her steps pausing for a split second before she kept going. The clerk watched her through the window, her pen tapping the desk, like she'd just seen something she couldn't quite place. The board meeting was in a sleek conference room, all glass and steel, with a view of the city skyline. The table was long, surrounded by men and women in sharp suits, their faces tight with impatience. Greg stood at the front, a projector humming as he clicked through slides. This individual, he said, pointing to a blurry photo of Amelia in the lobby, was alone with the vault. No one else had access. A board member, a woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace, leaned forward. "If she's just a customer, we need to act fast," she said, her voice sharp. Another board member, a guy with a slick beard and a Rolex, nodded. "We can't have this kind of thing tainting our reputation." Amelia sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded, a stack of printed photos in front of her. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes moving from Greg to the board members, taking in every word, every glance. The room felt heavy, the air thick with accusation. Greg kept going, his voice rising, pointing to timestamps, to security logs, to anything that could pin it on her. A junior board member, a woman in her 30s with nervous hands and a habit of checking her phone, glanced at Amelia's file on the table. Her eyes widened just for a moment as she saw the name Grant. She nudged the man next to her, whispering, "Is that?" He shushed her, but his own eyes darted to Amelia, his pen slowing on his notepad. Amelia didn't look at them. She just flipped through her photos, her fingers steady like she was rearranging a deck of cards. The room didn't notice, too caught up in Greg's performance, but the junior board member's hands were shaking now, her phone forgotten. She leaned back her chair, creaking, and whispered to herself, "This is bad." Amelia's eyes flicked up, catching hers, and the woman looked away, to her face pale, like she'd just stepped into something she couldn't undo. Then Amelia stood. The room went quiet like someone had flipped a switch. She placed a file on the table, her movements slow, deliberate. "These are the vault logs," she said, her voice calm but firm, like she was stating something undeniable. She clicked the projector remote, and a new slide appeared. Hallway camera stills clear as day, showing Greg entering the vault room 3 times after she'd left. The timestamps matched the logs. The board members shifted in their seats, their eyes darting from the screen to Greg. His face went pale, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Amelia didn't stop. She flipped open the file showing handover signatures. Greg's all three of them, each one tied to a vault access. "You opened it," she said, her eyes locking on his. "Not me." The room was dead silent now, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The CEO, Richard, who'd been quiet the whole time, leaned forward. "My apologies, Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice low but clear. The board members froze. Greg's hands dropped to his sides, his pen clattering to the floor. "Mrs. Grant." The name hung in the air heavy and sharp. The woman with the pearl necklace coughed, her hand flying to her mouth. The guy with the Rolex stared at his notes like he could hide in them. Greg's face was white now, his eyes darting to the door like he wanted to run. Amelia didn't say another word. She just closed the file, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door. The board members watched her go, their faces a mix of shock and shame. Richard stood his chair, scraping the floor. "We'll handle this," he said, his voice tight, but Amelia was already gone, her steps echoing down the hall. Back at branch number 5, the staff was called to the lobby. Greg, Tony, and Brittany stood in a line, their faces flushed, their eyes on the floor. Richard was there, his expression grim. "You will apologize to Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Greg stepped forward, his smile forced his voice shaking. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," he said. Brittany mumbled something similar, her nails digging into her palms. Tony just nodded, his jaw tight. As the apologies dragged on, a customer from the first day, a quiet older man in a worn jacket, stood at the back of the lobby watching. He'd been there when Amelia walked in, seen the whispers, the smirks. He'd kept his head down then, but now his hands were clenched, his eyes bright with something like pride. He stepped forward, his voice rough but steady. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said, loud enough for the staff to hear. "She's more than all of you combined." The lobby turned, surprised, but he didn't back down. Amelia glanced at him, her eyes softening for the first time, and gave a small nod. The man stepped back, his shoulders straight, like he'd said what needed saying. The staff shuffled, uncomfortable, their apologies trailing off. Amelia didn't respond, just adjusted her coat, her silence louder than their words. Amelia stood in the center of the lobby, her coat draped over her arm, her bag at her feet. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just nodded once and turned to the counter. The crowd, staff, customers, even the woman in the fur coat was silent, watching her every move. She filled out a withdrawal slip, her pen moving steadily, and handed it to a new teller, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. 10,000, please, she said, her voice soft but clear. The teller moved fast, counting out the cash with shaking hands. Amelia took the stack, walked to a small table in the corner, and signed it over to the local small business fund. She looked up, her eyes scanning the room, and said, "The money is mine, but trust is the real asset." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, rippling through the crowd. The woman in the fur coat slipped her phone into her purse, her face red. The guy with the gelled hair was already gone out the door without a word. Outside the bank, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the rumors of the theft and the board meeting. A local reporter, her notepad scribbled with notes, pushed through her camera guy trailing behind. "Mrs. Grant," she called, her voice eager but hesitant. "Can you comment on what happened?" Amelia paused, her hand on her bag, and turned to face her. The crowd hushed, waiting. "People see what they want to see," she said, her voice steady, her eyes holding the reporters. "But the truth doesn't need a spotlight." The reporter scribbled furiously, her camera guy zooming in, but Amelia was already turning away, her steps, calm like she'd said all she needed to. The crowd parted, some whispering her name, others just watching, their phones lowered, their judgment replaced by something else. Respect maybe, or regret. The fallout came quick. Greg was fired that afternoon, his office cleared out by security. His name was all over the bank's internal network, a cautionary tale pinned to every employee's inbox. Brittany was demoted, sent to a smaller branch across town, her red nails no longer tapping on the counter at branch number 5. Tony the guard was suspended, his badge pulled while they reviewed his role in the investigation. The woman in the fur coat. Her video hit social media, but not the way she'd hoped. Someone recognized her, tagged her name, and her followers dropped like flies. By the next week, she'd lost a sponsorship deal with a local boutique, her face no longer welcome at their events. The guy with the gelled hair tried to laugh it off at a bar that weekend, but his friends turned cold, their eyes avoiding his. The bank itself was changing too. The board launched a $50 million dignity fund money set aside to help customers who'd been mistreated, disrespected, judged for how they looked. Branch number 5 was gutted, turned into a training center for service excellence, with Amelia's words carved into a plaque by the door. Don't measure a customer by their clothes, measure them by how we treat them. The pinstripe suit guy from the line, the one with the cufflinks, found himself in a meeting with his boss the next day. His smug comment in the lobby had been caught on someone's phone shared online, and now his company's clients were asking questions. "You represent us," his boss said, his voice cold. "This isn't how we do business." The man's glasses slipped again, his hands fumbling with his tie as he tried to explain. By the end of the week, he was out of a job, his cufflinks packed away in a drawer. He didn't see Amelia again, didn't get a chance to apologize, but her words, "Manners don't need cufflinks," kept playing in his head, a quiet rebuke he couldn't shake. The bank's lobby, once his stage, was now just a reminder of a line he'd crossed. Amelia didn't stick around to watch it all unfold. She left the bank that day, her bag over her shoulder, her coat folded over her arm. The lobby was quiet as she walked out the marble, gleaming under the lights. She didn't look back, didn't need to. Her steps were steady, her head high, like she'd always known who she was. The truth had done the talking for her. The customers who'd mocked her, the staff who'd judged her, they were left to deal with the consequences, the weight of their own words. Amelia kept moving, her life unchanged, her purpose clear. She didn't need their apologies, didn't need their validation. She'd walked into that bank as herself, and she walked out the same way. Outside, a black car pulled up, its engine humming softly. The door opened and her husband stepped out. He was tall, quiet, his face calm, but commanding the kind of presence that didn't need a name. The crowd outside the bank froze, their eyes wide, their whispers dying out. He didn't say a word, just walked to Amelia and took her bag. She smiled at him, a small private smile, and they walked to the car together. The woman in the fur coat was there, her phone forgotten, her face pale. Greg, standing by the curb with a cardboard box of his things, looked away. Brittany, watching from the window, turned and walked back to her desk. The car door closed and they drove off, the city blurring past. Amelia leaned back in her seat, her hands folded, her eyes on the road ahead. "You've been there, haven't you? Judged for something you couldn't control, something you didn't choose. Looked down on, dismissed, made to feel small. But you kept going, didn't you? You held your head up just like she did. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. The truth always finds a way, even when it's quiet, even when it takes time." Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.